This, in a way, is to answer the question as to why hell is even necessary. Many people would find the notion of hell objectionable, but I think that there's good reason why it's worth considering what you might call infernal perception as much as purgatorial, which we'll come to and is about change, and then paradisal, which is about truth and understanding reality as it really is. I mean, one obvious answer to that right now is that bad and even evil exists, and it doesn't just exist elsewhere, it can exist in us as well. And so if that's to be taken seriously, not just to be treated as something that can be erased or expunged or quickly forgiven, then it's important to encounter it. And Dante certainly does that. You'll remember that he wakes up midway through the course of his life at the opening of the Divine Comedy and realizes very quickly that this is not just going to be an ordinary day. This is going to be the beginning of a journey that's going to change his life, not just help his life to continue as it had to that point. And encountering the darkness first is an important part of that change. Another way of thinking about this is that we are invited to perceive like God. And that's a central message, I think, of the Christian mystical tradition and, of course, of other mystical traditions as well. But we're invited to embark upon that as a process, not just as a kind of download. We're not spiritual robots. We're invited to know of the divine more and more fully as our own consciousness grows and expands. And so that therefore means encountering all aspects of consciousness and learning to cooperate, to navigate, to follow the line of beauty towards the divine, which necessitates understanding where that line of beauty goes astray and even turns very dark indeed. To put it another way, infernal perception can be understood quite as much as purgatorial and paradisal. And there's still mystery here. There's always mystery. The spiritual journey is one certainly of encountering horizons and seeing over horizons that seemed impossible to surpass at one point, but those horizons always throw up further horizons. This is part of what it is to travel into the infinity of divine life. So whilst there's still mystery here, and we're not talking about any neat, rational solution to, say, the problem of evil, but nonetheless, we are talking and exploring about how suffering can be meaningful because it can be understood, and in the understanding can be transcended, changed, incorporated even into the divine life. So that's a kind of abstract way of answering the question of why taking hell seriously is worthwhile doing. It's not just to give a kind of literal or fundamentalist answer that some people do bad things and God sends them to hell, or God can't tolerate what's bad. I don't think that's true at all. This is for our sakes, not for God's sake. And Dante offers us this first part of his journey for that reason. He constantly says throughout the Divine Comedy, "Can you follow me?" So what I thought I'd do is look at a dozen or so figures or groups of people that Dante encounters, not necessarily in the order that he encounters them, but to put some flesh on the bones as to what we experience when we experience the infernal, and to maybe implicitly suggest that that can be encountered in ourselves as much as elsewhere, and to build an understanding, therefore, of this infernal perception by just stirring it slightly within us. And then that will be an important part of the preparation before moving on to purgatorial and paradisal perception as well. Dante wakes up, thinks it's another day, the sun's rising. He tries to move towards the sunrise, knowing, even in his limited way at this stage, that to move towards the light is always a sensible thing to do. But he is prevented from doing so on this morning. And it gives us a first sense of being that's beginning to get caught in infernal states, because he thinks that he is navigating his life quite well. He is 35 or so years old, midway through the course of our life. He is a well-known politician, an even better known poet, already the creator of the sweet new style. And yet, for some reason, on this morning, he realizes that he doesn't know what he is doing at all. And the first hint as to what has begun to gone wrong for him is he's encountered by these three beasts: the prancing leopard, the proud lion, and the hungry wolf. And I think they are virtues that have become vices. And this can happen to us even on the spiritual path, because it's so easy to slip into enjoying, say, the peace that spiritual questing can bring, or enjoying the joy that a religious life can bring, or enjoying the insights that this kind of investigation into life definitely elicits, but enjoying them for their own sakes, rather than seeing them all, along with everything else, pointing to the true goal, which is God. And then when these qualities like, say, peace, joy, insight, become idols, become substitutes for the divine, they turn against us. They keep us trapped, and they lead us astray, and maybe they even start to frighten us because we realize they're not grounded in the divine as we're experiencing them in fact, but are fragile, are vulnerable, are held as our own possession, rather than becoming portals and leading us further into divine life. That's one way, at least, of interpreting what happens to Dante on this morning. You might say that he has become at risk of treating his success as his success and not seeing it as a reflection of divine life that he needs quite as much as everybody else. But he's also not alone, because Virgil appears, having been sent to guide him on this tremendous journey by Beatrice, the woman who woke love in him, by St. Lucy, and also by the Virgin Mary from the highest of the high heavens. And this gives us another taste of hell, and how somehow, in ways that aren't always clear to us, seeing the darkness is actually willed by heaven. This is to touch back on the sense I have that we're not spiritual robots. We are invited to know the divine life fully, which means knowing life as God knows it as well, which is to know all of reality. And of course, reality includes suffering, includes that which has fallen away, as much as that which is celebrating and rejoicing. And so Virgil's going to be Dante's guide, of course, and they set out on their way. And they first come into this vestibule of hell, having passed through the gates where they were told to abandon hope. Interestingly, I think that means that those who enter through the gates feel like hope has gone, not actually, as Dante will discover, because he has encountered this darkness, that hope has gone. But that's the kind of truth that you only realize when you've really faced down the darkness. But anyway, he enters through the gates of hell and meets these individuals, first of all, who they're called the Uncommitted. You can imagine them, as Dante describes them, walking around, led by someone holding a banner. They don't know quite why they're following this so-called leader, and they're afflicted by as many bugs and worms, kind of, you might say, the little things that can nip and bite us in life. And they've become so preoccupied with those distractions that they've sort of forgotten what life is about altogether. And it's so easy to live a life like that, and to find yourself, therefore, at risk of tipping into infernal states, rather than understanding that this mortal life right here, right now, is a training ground for the expansion of our being. It's not just to be frittered away, as I imagine the Uncommitted did. You might say that they're mistaken about the nature of time, that the now really matters, because, at least in principle, in every moment is a chance to step towards a greater understanding of our being and therefore of our calling, and not just to treat it as a moment to consume or plan for the future as you can see it, or worry about the past as you've experienced it and so remain unchanged. It's going to be a key lesson in the hell that people don't really experience now, don't experience the opportunity to change. They're either preoccupied with the past or terrified of the future. And of course, it doesn't take much more elaboration on that to realize that our times are very often preoccupied with the past, particularly in perhaps our own psychology, or preoccupied with the future in the desire to maintain our security at all costs. And of course, the complication is that our past do matter, our future does matter, but it can so dominate that it eclipses the chance for a new future to emerge, one that we have no idea about unless we're able to enter life as it comes at us right now. Another group of individuals they meet who are kind of on the edge of infernal perception, and are at risk of being stuck in it in another way, are the figures they encounter in Limbo. Now, Dante knew that Limbo is part of the teaching of the Catholic Church, and he immediately starts to challenge that teaching in the Divine Comedy, because a group of people that his fellows would have expected to meet there aren't there, notably the unbaptized. The people they do meet there are great poets, great philosophers, great luminaries who lived either before or without knowing of Christianity. And I think the symbolic significance of that, because without wanting to give the game away, by the time we get into the paradise, I think that the universalism of the Christian vision is actually starting to become clear, and all sorts of characters and figures are actually going to be there that Dante doesn't expect to see. But right here at this moment, with his own infernal perception growing, he meets, he sees, he encounters figures who you might say made the mistake of thinking that they could save themselves. That's one way I think of thinking of the figures, the philosophers, the poets that he meets. They stand for Dante for the effort to navigate a way to God through your own brilliance, which may well be brilliant, through your own genius, which may in a way be genius. And it does create light. One of the remarkable things about the Limbo is that it does have its own light, but it's a limited light. And this is another risk that can tip into infernal states of being, unless we realize that our light is just a reflection of the divine light, and it's in thy light that we shall see light, as the psalmist puts it. That's another provisional remark about the kind of being that can tip into an infernal being rather than lead to paradisal being. So they proceed now down through the circles of hell proper. And in the first circles, they meet individuals whose desires have been mistaken in one way or another. Now, these are figures who are now sort of properly trapped, you might say, unless their desires change. And the first group that they meet are those whose love has trapped them. It's become lust. It's become the love of love itself, or it's become the kind of love that felt it knew its object, particularly in another person, courtly love or romantic love, as we now think of it. And that's limiting, because love certainly can be awoken in us through another person, but that's just the start of it. And love has to learn how to grow more and more. And so I think that's why these figures are found in hell. They have the infernal vision because it's too limited. And Dante collapses at this moment. He realizes that this is a great risk for him. Beatrice awoke love in him, and he spent much of his life longing to be with her even after she died. And he realizes that he could have even frittered away his eternal life longing to be with Beatrice, rather than understanding how his love for her could lead her to greater and greater love. And so these figures in Canto 5 are swirling around in the love that has awoken in them, but that has trapped them. It's another important early step for Dante to understand. And so that's why he sees them even as his own limited trapped love stirs and comes to dominate him, hence his collapse. Another group of figures in these early rounds that they meet who have become trapped by the desire in a different way are those who are angry. Either they project that anger onto others and so just get caught in cycles of rage, or, very interestingly, from the psychological point of view, Dante knows that anger can trap us inside and so drain our energy away as we fight ourselves. Nowadays, it might be called having a persecutory superego, one that constantly judges you. And if you ever suffer from that, you know it's an infernal state. It can limit life horrendously. And Dante sees figures too like that, not full of rage's energy, but having the energy drain right out of them as they fight themselves. It's another infernal state because it doesn't lead anywhere. Much further down, Dante encounters the giants. And I wanted to put them in here, partly because Dorothy L. Sayers, her commentary on the Divine Comedy made a wonderful comment about them, I think, that they are great mounds of unprocessed emotion, of formless energy. And that's, again, a huge kind of insight as to what can keep us in infernal perception and so limit our awareness of being. Because emotion, feeling, sentiment, longing, desire isn't enough. It's certainly required, but it must be discerned. It must meet the intellect. It must meet the mind, and then can not only be channeled, but can grow and connect with more and more, not just itself. And so I wanted just to signal the giants in this part of our reflections on mistaken desires, ill-formed desires, and because that's another crucial thing that Dante learns. Love is not all you need, in fact, you might say. Love and the mind that can direct the longing is the way to find the way to God and to respond to the love and insight that is reaching out towards you. They come to another set of infernal traps, if you like. And I group these together as figures who have destroyed being in some way. You know, if all being comes from God, if light and love and longing and life itself is all a reflection of the divine presence, then to destroy being in life is to turn your back on being in one way or another. And so in one of the lower circles of hell, they come to a river of blood in which are those who are murderers in life, individual or genocidal murderers, and they're being kept in the river by these creatures of powerful rage, the centaurs. And that's another way in which life can become infernal for us. You know, perhaps very few of us are actual murderers nowadays, but murder is a thing that we can do quite happily in our own minds. You know, when you're thinking about how war breaks out, well, maybe just pay attention to dreams for a few nights, and you may well find that you have quite violent dreams as well as other ones. And sometimes I feel that war is just dream made horribly manifest in the world. Understanding how we can feel murderous is quite as important as seeing murderous figures as Dante himself does. I guess that the murderous side of him had to be awoken in this moment, come to his consciousness as he reached this part of infernal perception. Another difficult but subtle and in its own way fascinating group of people that Dante encounters who turns their backs on being are those who turn their murderous violence against themselves, and they enter at another point the wood of the suicides. The wood of the suicides, in which Dante discovers the individuals who killed themselves in life, turn their backs on their own bodies, are given new bodies in hell, and so become trees that bleed and call out when Dante snaps a branch. And it's a really fascinating moment in this darkness, because Dante has actually met other suicides earlier who aren't in the wood of the suicides, and in fact will meet people who killed themselves even in the saved realms like Purgatory. And so he's really pressing at us to understand what is going on here. It's not a sort of blanket condemnation of suicide at all. It's trying to understand the inner dynamics here, and why, not that it's an offense to God, but that why it can really cause people trouble. And in the stories of the people he meets in the wood of the suicides, he realizes, I think, that they're individuals who did a violence to themselves in order to try and harm others. So they were trying to, you might say, murder others in their self-murder, maybe because of vengeance, maybe because of cursing life itself. And it's another way in which, maybe even momentarily, we may all be at risk of flirting with infernal states, in response to, you know, sometimes in response to despair. But this is part of taking hellishness seriously. Despair can lead us into real darkness. And Dante discovers another aspect of that in the wood of the suicides. Another way in which we can lose touch with divine being is to feel that we have all the being we need inside ourselves, and that there is no wider being of which our own being is a participant and a reflection. And one moment where they encounter this face to face is in the figure of Capaneus. He is sitting on the edge of a region in hell called the Burning Sands, and he's cursing Jove using the name of Jupiter, partly, I think, signaling his own ignorance of God. He uses the ancient name, not realizing the name that's new and alive in his own time. But what's rather fascinating about this encounter with someone who's cut themselves off from divine being is that he doesn't even really know that he's suffering. And in some ways, you know, that's the worst state of affairs to be in. It's to be so confident of your own being and your own deluded powers. He's cursing Jove as if that would make any difference to Jove, that you don't even realize that you're trapped on infernal sands and that what you're suffering is self-caused. He's been rained on by flames, struck by bolts of fire, and doesn't realize that it's his own cursing that is causing that torment. It's so perverse in a way that he sees it as an expression of his own power. And so it's another very rich, dark moment in which Dante understands another aspect of this infernal trap, this infernal state of being. Another area in which we can mistake being, though, is sort of the opposite of blasphemy. If blasphemy is thinking that we have omnipotence, if we have all the being that matters, we can also become trapped if we are envious of the being that we see in others, and so don't own our own share in the divine being. And a little bit further along the infernal flaming sands, after they'd seen Capaneus, they meet various groups of people, including a bunch of Florentines who in Dante's own time had made a lot of money out of the mercantilism that was booming at his time, out of banking that was creating so much wealth. But these figures, for all that they had made of themselves, had clearly spent their lives coveting what others had and been driven to make money themselves so as to defeat and beat others in a kind of infernal competition. And in so doing, they had forgotten that they have an abundance of being inside themselves. They'd forgotten that true riches are freely given in life, and so find themselves now envious of this figure who they see approaching, Dante traveling through hell. They come up to him and do a kind of dance that helps them to stare more and more closely at Dante. But when they see that Dante hasn't actually got much to offer them, so they think, they lose interest and so move on. And Dante actually recognizes to curse them and distances himself from their envy of him. It's another way in which we can forget the divine being, not because we hold on to it, but because we envy it in others and so overlook it in ourselves. And then there's a third way in which the divine being gets traduced in this part of the hell. And this is a particularly difficult one, I think, for us now, because this is, as Dante sees it, in the figures of the usurers. He encounters figures who made a lot of money from money and have therefore fallen into the delusion that they can make reality themselves. I think part of the deep spiritual risk in usury is that it creates the sense that we human beings can create something out of nothing. And, you know, if you live in a city such as I do, like London, built on usury, quite literally, buildings springing up from the earth, built on borrowing, it looks like you can create something out of nothing in this cycle of usury. But is it storing up deep troubles for ourselves? Dante certainly thought so, if only because you forget that the one person that can create something out of nothing and did is the divine. But also, I guess, you may overlook that your house of cards could tumble at any moment. Dante lives at the beginnings of what we now call capitalism in the mercantile period of the early Renaissance. And we now know of the cycles of boom and bust that capitalism can cause. You might be able to manage that if you're a good chancellor of the exchequer. But there's a deeper spiritual risk, which you feel even more in our times, that we assume we can make the world around us, rather than understanding how we're called to co-create, to reflect, to respond, to mirror the divine life in our own lives, in our own creations, things that the usurers had forgotten altogether. So that's to say something about how we forget the nature of our being, following on from those who had misunderstood their desire. So now let's consider another way in which we, and certainly Dante, sees people who get trapped in infernal states, continuing the darkness. It's going to be a bit relentless, the darkness, this talk. And I think that is in terms of our perception. Here, I want to touch on Dante in one of the Bolgia of the place called Malebolgia, in the seventh circle of hell, deep down now, where Dante encounters the figure of Bertrand de Born, who is famously holding his head decapitated from his body as if it were a lantern. And this is a Bolgia in which Dante encounters the risks of fundamentalism and literalism head on. Bertrand de Born literally believes he can only see by his own light. And so his head, his eyes have become a lantern. And this is particularly devastating for the spiritual path, because the spiritual path must learn to move beyond the literal. It must pass through what Dante himself describes as the allegorical perception, which can see the meaning in things, through the tropological perception, which is that allows us to have our perception expanded and transformed, to reach over the horizons that we thought were the boundaries of our sight, through conversion, through epiphany, through revelation, through being met by the divine light, and then into the fourth state, which he wrote about in other places, the anagogic, which is seeing things from the perspective of eternity, the embrace of all things, the understanding of the whole of reality, which is the divine privilege that we're invited to share. And so this is a really important moment for Dante to understand the deep spiritual dangers of fundamentalism and literalism, seeing by your own light. It causes fracture, it causes violence in the human world, because the next thing that happens after you believe that you've got the light to see things are right by is that you start attacking those who claim the same of their own light, and you are compelled to say, no, you're wrong, this is how to see it. And so schism and discord is a frequent feature of religious traditions, such as the danger of this infernal perception, this narrowing of being. It happens in a different way when we use people to our own ends. And Dante's particularly interesting in how this happens when we abuse hospitality. Some of the people who are in the darkest states in hell abuse a seeming generosity to then take advantage of others. And, you know, this is such a travesty because, of course, the whole of life is a generous, hospitable act from the source and wellspring of life, freely and richly given. So to invite others into your own part of that hospitality and then to turn on them is a dark act indeed. And one of the figures that Dante encounters here is a Franciscan called Fra Alberigo, and he'd invited some of his kin and associates to a dinner and had then used them in their vulnerable moment, used the vulnerable moment to turn on them and murder them. And maybe part of what's going on in such a violent act is, in this moment, not actually just revenge, it's not hate, it's not other motivations that might have been involved. I think that the reason why Fra Angelico is in such a deep part of hell is because he took life to be scarce. He took life to be a kind of zero-sum game, that if he wanted more of it, others had to be destroyed in the process so he could take their share. And, you know, that's such a profound misunderstanding of the abundance of the generosity of life. It's not just to wonder whether there's more, it's to have decided that there isn't more, and you must therefore grab what's around you. And so you can see why that would lead you into an infernal perception, mistaken perception of being. Now, there are other reasons why people get trapped in hell that aren't just about their own inner life or perceptions, but are to do with others, what others do to them, or indeed the times in which they lived. And so I wanted to say something about that as well. If we've talked about mistaken desires, talked about mistaken understanding of the nature of our being, and then also mistaken understanding about the nature of our sight. So you might also say that external forces can have a great impact upon us and put us at risk unless we're aware of them. And one famous moment, I think, where Dante sees some of this is deep down in the Inferno on the icy lake, where he comes across the figure of Ugolino and the Archbishop Riviera. And Ugolino's story seems tragic. I mean, indeed, it is tragic. He made an enemy of the Archbishop. The Archbishop then locked him in a tower and nailed shut the door, where Ugolino starved with his children. And so when Dante hears this story, he's moved by it, and I guess wonders why Ugolino is here. But although a travesty was done against this figure, he was swept along, you might say, I think, with the energy of this travesty, and so lost himself in the process. Dante partly leaves us wondering what had happened that was so desperate to Ugolino, but it seems that in a way, in the mix of revenge and hate and wanting to get back at the Archbishop that filled his soul, pity did as well, despair. He gave up on hope. Some say he even consumed his children in this tower. That's sort of half hinted at, and so fell into a dark place, not so much just because of what was going on in him, but what was going on in him prompted by desperate events around him. And, you know, it can seem harsh that Dante sees this in hell, but there's a truth about it, that we can be swept along by events and lose ourselves even as we're swept along by events. So this is a really important kind of lesson and reminder that Dante learns at this point. It expands in another way, where Dante, talking with Virgil, is told about a great figure called the Old Man of Crete. And the Old Man of Crete, I think, is a kind of metaphor for when not just events overwhelm us, but when a whole civilization's mistakes overwhelm us. The Old Man of Crete is pictured as standing underneath the mountain in Crete, which is halfway between Egypt and Rome, Italy, the old civilization, you might say, that had fallen, and the new civilization that I think Dante perceives in his time was beginning to fall. And the Old Man of Crete is a figure whose head is made of gold and silver, whose chest and arms are made of bronze, and whose legs are made of terracotta. And what this image signals is a great civilization that's forgotten what's truly of worth in its inheritance. It's forgotten its gold and silver, and that which enables it to see clearly in its head, to think clearly, the bronze that enables its heart to love and desire clearly. And instead, Virgil tells Dante that the Old Man of Crete is leaning more and more on his terracotta feet, and that's the weakest, least valuable part of him, and they're beginning to crumble. They can't support the great weight of the civilization anymore. And so it's a remarkable image that says Dante's not just thinking about personal journeys here, not even thinking about how we might live in a time that can do us down, but how civilizations themselves can fall into infernal perception and lose the capacity to know of paradise. And I must say that with my book, doing publicity and so on around it, it's very striking how people want to know about the hell, want to know about the Inferno. You know, on the radio with the 700th anniversary of Dante's Divine Comedy, presenters would say they feel comfortable talking about hell, but aren't sure about paradise. They might even only make a program about hell, or artists illustrating the Divine Comedy might decide they can only really illustrate the Inferno. It seems to me that says a huge and rather terrifying amount about our civilization and its state of being. One of the reasons why Dante can still speak to us 700 years on, because he's quite clear this is just the first part, a necessary part, but just the first part of three. And if it's important to understand infernal perception, it's partly important to understand it, only to realize that there's a whole lot more besides. And if you forget there's a whole lot more besides, if your civilization isn't aware of that anymore, then you're rather like the Old Man of Crete. You've forgotten your gold and silver and are relying solely on the crumbling terracotta. And then there are also, I think, cosmic failures, you might say, that Dante encounters, or at least by that I mean infernal dynamics and forces around us from the non-human world. This comes up in the way that Dante meets various kinds of demon. Now, the demons that he meets on the edge of the city of Dis, fairly high up in the Inferno, it turns out are sort of all show and very little substance, in fact. And so whilst they're frightened of their appearance on the walls of the city of Dis, an angel appears and in double quick time dispels the demons. They're equally terrified of themselves, you might say, as frightening others. So some of the non-human forces that we might encounter, we need to remember that they're not actually frightening at all. Others are more actively malign, and in the place called Malebolgia, a region of the Inferno further down, they meet demons who have much more deliberate and malign intentions against the souls that they're keeping trapped, enforcing the suffering of, but turn against Dante and Virgil too, in one of the most dramatic parts of the Divine Comedy. They are subtle manipulators, they're liars, they're seeming friends. They tell Dante and Virgil that they can guide them through this part of the Divine Comedy, and getting confused, getting lost themselves, because to enter hell is to become full of hellish perception yourself. For a period, they're fooled by these demons. And so that's another kind of warning. Be careful who's leading you. Be careful what lines you're following. And indeed, in Malebolgia, they meet various figures who have mistaken their own powers, mistaken their own demons, you might say, their own guides. People like the soothsayers, whose trust was too sure in that which they felt was guiding them through life, and so has trapped them. And then, of course, right at the floor, right at the bottom of the Inferno, they encounter Lucifer himself. But do you know, even here, there's something pathetic about this darkness, this evil, for all that it definitely can freeze people in the icy lake that is on the floor of hell. Because Lucifer can hardly move. His wings, Dante tells us, were like feeling the air coming from the wings of a windmill at a distance, just a kind of faint, mechanical, automatic movement, not a movement of life, not a movement of light and energy. I sometimes think that Lucifer had become a bit like a fish head when it's been cut off and its mouth is just opening and closing by some kind of echo of life. And I think that's partly what enables Dante and Virgil to find the way out of the Inferno by climbing right onto Lucifer's body. Another one of the great reveals of the Divine Comedy is that if you bring your understanding to darkness, you also bring light to it. And that's to begin to understand that the light is stronger than the darkness. It's to begin to understand that divine being never lets any being go, in fact. And if you can align even with that faint memory of divine being, as I think it must have come in Dante's mind in this dark place, then you can follow its track and make the turnaround. You might say there's divine design even in this darkest place. The gates of hell, as I mentioned at the top, have the famous lines, "Abandon hope, all who enter here." But they also remark about how this place is made of divine love, how this place is made of divine justice. And at first you might read that as the divine love hating what it can't tolerate, the divine justice wanting to expel that which has gone wrong. But I think there's a subtler understanding which Dante gets by having seen it all at this point, which is that justice is actually about everything finding its place. And whilst for a time, at least, that place may be in the darkness, because that's what the individual has wittingly or unwittingly willed or found themselves in, ultimately justice is about restoring everything to its divine place, which, because God is the creator of all things, is with God. And my sense is that crawling onto the body of Lucifer to find the way out of hell is a first clear indicator we have, which will be developed through the Purgatory and the Paradise, that even Lucifer isn't to be left in this dark place for all eternity. Dante has to see Lucifer in this state, if you like, in order to understand what brought Lucifer there, and so know of the pride that can bubble up inside himself. That's absolutely crucial. But even here, things aren't quite static. And so the divine love, the divine justice is not just condemning, but even here is working to transform. You know, sometimes it's said that the obstacles are the way. And certainly Lucifer, in part of the divine revelation, is the way at this moment as well. There's other moments of light in the Divine Comedy too, to start to bring some lightness back to this evening at least. You know, I mentioned Limbo and how Limbo has its own light. Another really wonderful encounter that Dante has is with the figure of Ulysses. And Ulysses had followed his own light, a bit like Bertrand de Born, but it has enough spirit and aspiration in it in order to feel that maybe this is just a temporary state for Ulysses as well. When Dante first sees him, he thinks that Ulysses looks like fireflies dancing in the early evening, a rather beautiful image. And so even in the Inferno, you can spot moments of beauty, and it's as if we're being invited to join the dots in those moments. You might say that whilst people in hell feel no hope, there's still hope being given to infernal states of mind if the light of understanding can be brought to bear by experiencing and witnessing, seeing the ways in which things can go so very wrong. The divine encompasses all, and we're called to know all in order to share in the divine life.